I rise in support of SB 3. I want to start by thanking the co-authors, my colleagues from San Francisco and Chino, for your leadership that started last year on this effort. In particular, thanks to the Pro Tem for his recent leadership in forging what I think is a historic agreement. I also rise today in recognition of the interesting coincidence that we today mark the birthday of Cesar Chavez as we stand prepared to pass a historic bill to raise the minimum wage in California. When I had the honor of working with UFW, I recall the minimum wage that farm workers were earning was $1.60 an hour. And so we look at the rise in inflation, the rise in wages generally, and then I look at the region I currently represent, where 2 years ago an economist reported, an independent economic group, that a living wage in my region would be $18 an hour. And that living wage would purchase a one-bedroom apartment for a family living in Monterey County. So this doesn't bring us close to that $18 an hour. In fact, the compromise reached doesn't bring us to the $15 an hour until 2022. And so as I hear from some constituents who are concerned about impacts on their businesses, I think it's important that we offer that comparison that was offered by the author from San Francisco. Already qualified for the November ballot was a measure that would have moved California to the $15 an hour more rapidly. It would have had no pause buttons for economic downturns, and it would have provided more benefits to low-income workers. So this represents a compromise, and it represents a compromise that I believe is prudent. It's one that has a graduated pathway. My fear is that by 2022, $15 an hour may actually put a low-income worker at a lower level vis-a-vis the federal poverty level than they are today. So just as we need to measure real-world economic impacts, we've got to keep in mind the low-income workers for whom this bill has been advanced, and the prospect of bringing dignity to work. You know, Marge Piercy, one of my favorite authors and a poet, a feminist, she has a saying, just as a pitcher needs water, a worker needs meaning in their work. And many people who work for minimum wage work in repetitive work that doesn't always have meaning on the surface. It's repetitive, it's thankless, it's hard work. And workers don't always see how that fits into a broader mosaic of a strong economy. But what they do know is if that paycheck they take home is going to get them close to paying the rent, close to having a little extra for a birthday present for a child. So members, I expect that our vote will divide on partisan lines, and yet I think it's important that we see today as an incremental step in forging a history that Cesar Chavez sacrificed to bring not just a higher wage to workers in their work, but dignity to the lowest income workers. Members, I urge an aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Monning. Senator Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, colleagues, for a good debate, a good discussion, and I appreciate the tensions between what's good for workers and what's good for business owners. And I see this bill as very serious, and I see it as an inflection point. We're gonna look back on this vote a few years from now, and we're gonna see which side of the debate was correct. We're gonna find reverberations that will be very significant. and we're going to enjoy what I call the law of unintended consequences. You'll find out things that this will cause that we hadn't even talked about here in the debate. 22 years ago, after I predicted the bankruptcy of the County of Orange, newspapers like the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal gave me names like Cassandra and Jeremiah. And so 16 years ago, I was very public and said the passage of SB 400 in 1999 will have significant financial impacts. And SB 400 was the 3% at 50 bill. And now we're seeing cities suffer and going into bankruptcy. And I just want to import that this bill will have major negative impacts, I believe, on the state of California. And once you vote for it, even though you have a pause button, you can't go back. This vote is so critical, you cannot go back. So with rising wages, you have rising workers' compensation insurance, you have payroll taxes. This state hasn't even paid off its FUTA liability, the federal unemployment tax. Our employers are already paying a premium with just 2 other states that's higher than any of the other 47 states just because we're behind in paying our balance due to the federal government. And we're going to have higher Social Security taxes that the owners have to pay. So one businessman emailed me last night, and he said, I have a spa, I have 30 employees, and I did the math, and I decided this weekend I'm not opening a second location. There's 30 jobs. You will see a lot of businesses probably go underground, start paying more cash. An area that this state really needs to focus on is trying to prevent the underground economy from prevailing. But what happens is when you have a business that is underground is that it outbids and takes business away from our honest businesses that are paying all the costs of employing people. So we are either going to drive them out or we're going to drive them under. Now, as to business owners, if you look at the data from the state, currently 17% of our taxpayers pay 87% of the personal income taxes, less than 1 in 5. And the personal income tax is 65% of the revenues that this state receives to fund its budget. So if you raise those expenses on the producers and the risk takers, you're going to find that they're going to have lower taxable incomes. You're going to see a net reduction in our revenues. And then we're going to come along with other fine bills that'll do great things. We're going to do Senate Bill 1234, which will encourage or mandate that certain employers have pension plans, which will be another cost. And then we're going to raise tobacco taxes, and then we're going to raise gas taxes. But you're going to see your tax revenues go down net. They will not increase. So colleagues, California already has a net migration out. The data is there. We're talking about looking at data. In California, for the first time since World War II, has a declining school enrollment. Something is happening in this state. And cramming down a minimum wage increase will damage an already fragile economy. If you look at the statistics just from LA County alone, they haven't improved in almost a decade. So thank goodness that California has Silicon Valley. So once taxpayers wake up and see their newspaper headlines tomorrow morning, the business owners are going to go, is this an April Fool's joke? Really? An increase in the minimum wage of 50%. We're not talking from $7.15 to $7.50. We're not talking 35-cent pay increase. We're talking a 50% increase. And they will do the math. And when you do the math, you realize that you're going to have to raise your prices 20% to cover the increased cost and the expected loss of clients. So what does that do to retirees on a fixed income? So this solution may help some, but I believe it will hurt many, many more. Your governor, your Department of Finance, your legislative analyst office They've all publicly published remarks about what a minimum wage increase will do to the state of California. The Department of Finance, this would lead to slower personal income growth and an anticipated negative impact on taxes collected. The governor just recently said higher minimum wage laws are not free. They raise the operating costs of many businesses, and the state must shoulder higher wages in its programs. And the Legislative Analyst's Office said this measure likely would reduce the number of jobs in the California economy. I don't know if these are partisan, just alone, and as a supervisor, we were kind of glad that at the county, the state decided to assume negotiating for in-home support services. And they were pretty much just making a little bit over minimum wage, and we knew that minimum wage was going to rise, so we knew the state was going to be responsible for negotiating it. But even the governor is saying that a minimum wage increase will impact our state budget in the next 3 or 4 years by billions. I mean, it was a $4 billion number in one document. So that's my prediction. I don't see this as just a minor wage increase that we've sustained over decades of time. I see this as massive. I see the future is not very bright. And I think that if the governor signs this into law, instead of fighting the ballot measures and defeating them, that we're going to have, like I said, a major inflection point in our state's history. Colleagues, I'm opposed to SB 3 and its amendments. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Senator Glazer.
Thank you, Mr. President, members. It's a big day today with a lot of choices and consequences before us. For many, it was a day too long in coming, I know, and for many, it was a day that maybe has come a little bit too fast. We can always use more time. I voted against this. I declined to support this bill when it came before us last year. And I want to talk about the reasons for that and why today might be a different day. You know, there's no doubt about the positives that come out of the legislation that's before us, lifting millions out of poverty. What an incredible opportunity to help so many. But the big challenges in this issue of minimum wage, for me at least, have focused around the issue of the spikes, the rapid rise in cost and obligations to business, as well as the issue of the COLA and indexing that gives the appearance of an out-of-control cost increase that no one really can make choices about. And I want to talk about both of them. You know, I did see in the documents that I got over the last couple days that we're celebrating the 100th birthday of the minimum wage, established in 1916 here in California. And when you look at the history of the wage over time, there's a couple things that are worth noting. Number one, that it experienced a lot of these sudden spikes through the course of those 100 years, that there were periods of big rapid increases followed by not a lot going on. You can go back and look at periods of time that you think might match today or might not match today in terms of what we're facing and where our economy is. You can go back to 1996 to 2002. We raised the minimum wage 58% in those 6 years, from 96 to 2002, very similar to what's being proposed in this legislation today. During the inflationary times of the late 70s and early 80s, we raised the minimum wage 67% in 3 years. In the early 70s, we raised it 51% in 2.5 years. I would note that 2 of those raises were done under the signature of Governor Reagan. Both in 1968, the minimum wage was raised, and he signed legislation providing almost a 27% increase in the minimum wage. And in 1974, the legislature passed, and Governor Reagan signed a 21% increase in the minimum wage. And certainly you can even go back and look at the period during the war, World War II, and right after, the legislature raised the minimum wage 97% in 4.5 years. So this issue of spikes is a real issue. I think no matter what side of the debate you're on, you'll say that's not a healthy thing for business. It's not a healthy thing that allows folks to plan and make choices and adjustments. Yet, when we go back and look over these 100 years, we see that issue of spikes, and it's an uncomfortable one. In the 100 years of the minimum wage, we've raised it 27 times, and a lot of it has been in these areas, these years of spikes, where the pressure is off, and then the pressure builds up, and the legislature and the governor acts. The second area that I looked at carefully is this issue of COLAs, where you have no choice, that it's always going to go up. And so what I tried to do was to look back over the last 40 years and say, if we had the bill that's before us today in effect, what would be where would the minimum wage be today? Where would it be? What would be facing a minimum wage out of control that would create great distress and harm to our economy or not? And what I found was that if you go back 40 years, and I know conditions change, so I tried to take a wide span of time, the minimum wage today, and let me make this caveat, that the proposal before us is not an index without caps. The proposal before us is an index with a cap, a 3.5% cap. So I applied those criteria to that view of where would our minimum wage be today. And if we go back 40 years, the minimum wage today, not $10 where it currently sits, would be $5.68 under the bill that's before us right now with the 3.5% cap. If you go back and you look at it, let's say 30 years from today, under the conditions of this bill, what would the minimum wage be? It would be $6.80. And even if you went back 10 years, the minimum wage under this legislation would be $8.03, well below what we currently have as our minimum wage. So for me, at least, on one hand, you have this issue of spikes, yes, moving the minimum wage up in a large amount over a period of years. On the other hand, it's balanced by a proposal that has an index with a cap that provides a much more conservative level of, certainly if you look back historically, at what that wage may be. And so were you to apply that look in the crystal ball going out 40 years, again, with an economy that we know will shift and change as it has over the last 40 years, you have the negative side of the increase, the quick increase, at least over 6 years, not that quick, balanced with a index with a cap that's going to allow for a much gradual and more predictable change over the next, not 6 years, but 10, 20, 30, 40-year time horizons that will get us to a place of much more balanced and predictable situation. So when I looked at the original bill that came before us last year and what's before us today, I do see these very significant differences. It does do what we have done over 100 years, which is the pressure builds up and then we act with a much more substantial increase, balanced out with this indexing with a cap. Finally, I want to make a couple of additional points, some of which have been made by members earlier. The proposal for the increase in the minimum wage has nothing to do with any kind of government giveaway. It's only earned by someone working very, very hard in difficult jobs, repetitive jobs, whether it's picking the crops in the field or serving us in restaurants, taking care of the elderly and the disabled, providing maintenance around our homes and around our shops. It's actually going to help reduce government subsidy for many people by bringing so many out of poverty. And finally, the issue of who's paying for this. We know there's consequences for business, but the cost of this is going to be borne by everybody at every level of income, whether they're the poorest or the wealthiest. And in fact, it's easy to understand why those on the lower economic spectrum are actually going to pay more for the actions that we're going to take today than those on the top. And I'll tell you, people talk a lot about global warming as being the issue of our time. I actually think the issue is income inequality. That when you drill down to what creates destabilization within society and within democracies, it is the gap between the haves and the have-nots. It's destabilizing and it's dangerous. And it does require our careful attention. And it does require thoughtful action, which I believe is reflected in the bill that's before us. No bill is perfect. There are issues and concerns raised today, and I know we all have about its impact on business, its impact on employment. It is going to require us to carefully watch what happens and to be in a position to correct problems as they are raised. But on balance, this is a measure that in the 100th year birthday of the minimum wage, I think is a positive and productive step forward that will create a consistency, a predictability that will enable our both business and workers to prosper here in the Golden State. And with that, I ask for an aye vote.
Thank you. Senator Bates.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. With no intention for disrespect, certainly to my colleagues and their noble intentions with this measure, or any personal lack of sensitivity to the economic challenges that I know our low-income workers face, I do rise in opposition to the measure. I believe it is a short-term fix that will create long-term negative impact for providing job opportunities that can move our low-wage earners up the economic ladder. And colleagues, for me, that is the moral imperative that we have here in our legislature. I have taken calls and emails from constituents and business owners who've confirmed my belief that SB 3 is a false promise to those who are struggling to get ahead. And let me share with you some comments from Main Street, California small business. They are barely out of the Great Recession, and immediately following, they've had to absorb higher costs from the Affordable Care Act. New California sick pay regulations, increases in workers' compensation insurance, new regulations and cost of disposal and permits for hazardous waste disposal, new costs of complying with CARB and local air district regulations, and of course, most recently, a minimum wage increase. To stay in the black, better said, to stay in business, they must pass these increases on to consumers where possible, raising the cost of what? Goods and services, and thus the cost of living. To me, that's economic 101. They warn that sustaining a 50% increase in the cost for employees as proposed in this bill will cause them to downsize or perhaps close their businesses. One medium-sized business I spoke with provided the reality check that closing just one location, and this individual has many locations, will have the following. Those 30 employees that my colleague from Orange County mentioned will lose their jobs, and many of them are senior citizens who have those jobs to supplement their retirement incomes. 25 sales reps that go to this one location will lose an account to call on. One more vacancy in the shopping center that this business occupies, and loss of sales tax for the state. This is just one example of the impact to the private sector. And what about our public sector? The hit to the state's general fund, we've heard it over and over again, $4 billion. That's not modest. Members, we do have a special session underway to deal with our transportation infrastructure crisis. That special session was called to address what? A $3 to $6 billion shortfall. The answer, piling on more tax increases and fees, seems to be the proposal. How is it that we don't have money to repair or expand our transportation infrastructure, which, by the way, creates jobs at every economic level? But we can take more than $4 billion from a general fund to finance a wage increase that has diminishing diminished buying power and no path to poverty over several years. This tells me there's something amiss with balancing our priorities here in our legislature, so I must respectfully oppose this measure. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bates. Senator Hall.
Thank you, Mr. President, and my colleagues. I was not going to speak, but I sat at my desk and I wonder, where are we? Where are we? Is this really California? I'm listening to all the technical jargon and the rhetoric of the most distinguished members of this body. I'm asking the question, are we really in California? Because we can talk about COLAs, and we can talk about indexing, we can talk about all of these technical terms. But the reality is when you go to your districts and you speak in front of a room with 500 struggling families, and you talk about COLA and indexing, they will look you stare face in the eye and ask you, what in the heck are you talking about? Why? Because they're trying to figure out a way to buy their children diapers. They're finding out a way to buy their children milk. Or how might they be able to pay their utility bills? Or how might they be able to pay their rent? These are not families, my friends, that are putting away money for a rainy day fund. These are not families that are planning vacations to Europe. These are not families that are driving in Teslas and Mercedes-Benz. These are not those families. These are families that are saying, I'm struggling and no one is listening to me. In Compton, in Watts, in South Los Angeles, in the Harbor Gateway area, where rent is $1,500 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. And let me tell you something, $10.50 an hour, which is what it's gonna go to next year, is $1,680 a month. So even the increase next year, of $10.50 at $680 a month still would not afford a family, a parent, to be able to afford an apartment, a one-bedroom apartment in Compton and Watts. And so we're sitting here with all these technical behaviors, proselyting like great people. And the real question is, can any one of you in and on this floor actually live off of $680 a month? Can any one of you, ladies and gentlemen, afford for your own child to live off of $1,680 a month? And I will beg to say no. We have a fundamental responsibility to make sure we lift up as we climb this state. We have a fundamental responsibility to make sure when we go back to our respectful districts, that we say we advocated and fought for the most vulnerable population of our community, but yet for some of the most harding working families in our community. And I believe that if our workers are going to work every day, making companies the money that the CEOs will be able to buy their private jets, at least they can go home with dignity and pride knowing that their own utilities are being able to be paid. And so I don't look at this as a Republican issue. I don't look at this, my friends, as a Democratic issue. I look at it as a humanity issue, as an issue with pride, dignity, and respect, where parents and single women, mothers will be able to go home and replace their tears with pride, knowing that they too can go home and take care of their families and buy groceries. That's what this is about. That's what this is about. So let's talk about our COLAs and let's talk about our indexing. But the folks in our communities, they're trying to buy groceries. They're trying to pay their rent and their utility and figuring out which one is most important for that month. And so on behalf of the California Legislative Black Caucus and as a chair of the caucus, we support SB 3 and we thank the author for bringing this piece of legislation forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hall. I just want to remind our friends in the gallery that there's no comments or responses, please. Next, we have Senator Stone.